Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take one giant book, break it down bit by bit, section by section, talk about it, analyze it, have jokes, have fun, just shoot the shit. This season we are doing JR by William Gaddis, and we're going to be talking up through page 491 today. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, joined as always by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox.
Hi, Chad. It's a pleasure to be here on this No Hall of Fame inductee day.
I was waiting to see if you were going to mention my little thrilling obsession from yesterday. But
go right in with baseball because I know you're interested.
And we have special guest, Dan O'Brien, playwright, who has written a number of plays, including The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, which we were just talking about. And then the one that won the Penn Award is The House in Scarsdale, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yep. And has a brand new book that is coming out in the UK now called The Story That Happens on Playwriting, Childhood, and Other Traumas, which I've read recently and really enjoyed.
Thank you. Thanks.
So thank you for joining us.
Of course.
Super exciting because I wanted to have someone who's a playwright on here to talk about JR. Yeah. And we can get into that part of it along the way. But just first off, like, how are you doing? And how do you find William Gaddis? This is your first William Gaddis?
This is my first. I mean, yeah, I was intrigued when you asked me if I might want to come on the podcast because I've read about him. I've of course heard about his books, but I've never actually sat down and to try and read any of his work, but certainly his two, The Recognitions, which is even longer, and then this book. And on one level, I'm sure I was probably just intimidated. I mean, it's as I hate the word, it's a difficult read or a challenging read, or, you've got to think a lot, but you've got to think while you're reading it the way you do when you read a play. I mean, part of what was interesting about it for me, and I think it's in that book that's coming out that Chad, you just read, that book of mine, the idea that a play script is almost by design difficult to read. It's much easier. That's why in the theater, if you're working on a script and you're developing a script or trying to interest a theater in a script, they'll almost always do a cold reading or a rehearsed reading of the play rather than actually just sitting down and reading the script. Because even producers and dramaturgs and, seasoned theater people don't really like reading a play. Yeah. For a lot of the reasons why this book is difficult, right? Because it's unattributed dialogue. There's very little, I'm going to say stage directions in this case, or there's stage directions that are incredibly beautiful often or literary, but they're not, they're not necessarily clarifying whatsoever. Sometimes they're more baffling than the dialogue, when it does happen. So it was really fascinating to just try to relate to it as a 700 and some odd page play and or screenplay.
Yeah.
And I was also intrigued, and I've done a little bit of internet digging, just intrigued by Gaddis's relationship to screenwriting.
What did you find about that? I don't know anything about that.
Just that, there are references in the book to this Western, right? This Western screenplay. I forgot the title. It was something ridiculous.
Oh yeah, it absolutely.
Well, was it Once at Antietam?
Oh,
no, that was the play. That's the play he wrote.
That's the play that's in Frolic of His Own.
Right.
Wow.
And apparently is very closely. I mean, it's referring to a play that he actually did write at some point before JR.
Yes.
That he claims he spent some amount of years on, and it didn't really go anywhere.
This book is littered with those references to like the first act. The guy just comes out. I think it's in the section. The guy just comes out on stage and explains everything. They're like, right. Work. And like in the Frolic of His Own, when they talk about the play, there's the similar critiques of it. Like the Frolic of His Own is set up where the main character is suing this film producer who had made this big blockbuster movie about the Civil War that has a similar story to the play that he wrote that never got produced because nobody wanted to produce it, but he sues them for plagiarism. Right. And that's the basis. But then it doesn't work because they say, well, you were just plagiarizing Plato. And what's the difference?
That's great.
But
that's amazing. Well, I mean, because you read this and you have to think, anybody, but certainly a playwright or scriptwriter would read this and think, well, why is this a novel as opposed to, I mean, if he is so interested in dialogue, why is it written as a novel as opposed to some kind of dramatic performance, or and of course it's very different than a play and a screenplay in many ways,
Right.
But that was sort of a big open-ended question for me.
Yeah.
I mean, you've probably already covered this. You probably already talked about like why is it all dialogue?
No.
No,
Not exactly. I mean, I don't know. Do you have a theory, Brian, or a good response?
I think it works so well for two reasons. One, with it being like the chaotic, like fragmented postmodern aspect of it, all the noise works really well. And then when you think of all the financial transactions going on all over the phone, with talking to a secretary and then confusing it with a lawyer, and the lawyer's confusing that with somebody getting lunch, and they're all doing this weird. If you put in stage directions, or if you're putting in too much prose in between that, it would just deflate it, and it wouldn't have that just like that snappy energy. And I think it's meant to be really confusing and chaotic. And what better way to do that than unattributed dialogue all over the place?
Yeah.
In a way, it's like the most American book.
Yeah.
Like just everyone talking over each other and not really listening.
Right. Not listening, try to assert themselves and make a sell. Yeah.
And think about when he puts most of that in is when they're in that apartment and everything's falling over on them. Right. So even then it's still chaotic and like making you feel claustrophobic.
Right.
And so I think maybe he did it. I think it works really well at giving us that feeling of just nothing makes any sense. How does anybody make any sense out of this?
That is like taking that into one step further as like a sort of strategic approach. Like if you did include like novelistic elements, like the exposition, the frame settings, the like ways of moving people around, that's so much order. Like it's artificial. I mean, it's part of like, he's part of that movement of like the Barth and Gass and everyone who is like questioning the reality of fiction and how fiction it should be undercut and how you can deal with that. And so like in this book, that's pure entropy. Like to have those sections that are like novelistic would kind of counteract that in a way. So as a strategy, maybe it makes the most sense to let the voices ride. And even those interstitial parts are like, they're kind of there, but they're also very poetic in the sense that they're not really even sentences or like a normal straightforward description or movement. They just seem almost at times random, but they're like, they describe what's being in like kind of in front of the character, but they're not like a normal book moving you along.
Right.
I have a question before you get into this. So related to theater stuff, how is that going with like, what is the situation now given COVID and given everything? Like this seems like a very weird space to be in for theater and for everything.
Yeah. I mean, how are you okay with grown men crying on this?
We love it. We're all for it. The more tears, the better. The things we approve of are tears and making fun of Ohio.
I mean, it's very strange. I mean, I don't want to speak. I can't speak for everybody, but it's just, everyone keeps sort of pushing the, things will be normal in 6 months, things will be normal in a year, or things will be, but really the big question is we don't know. I mean, it's hard. I think most theater people, it's hard to imagine that like people will never want to sit in a theater and see live theater. I think the question is, is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 2 years? It's probably going to be a gradual thing where, some theaters that have survived are going to start reopening and doing it in special ways and finding ways to survive, with diminished audiences, because it's going to, I assume it's going to take a while for people to want to come back to this theater and feel comfortable or have the money, so it is a strange time. I mean, I think, so many playwrights I know also write for TV and film or teach, just like so many other literary writers, so I think there's been a certain amount of pivoting, if we can, towards those other genres just to make a living. I mean, again, part of being a playwright is about as lucrative as being a poet. So, playwrights already aren't really making a living just being a playwright. So in that sense, it's kind of been anticlimactic. It's cut off a certain amount of funding and opportunities that would have been there before. I would think, I don't know. It's strange. It is strange. Obviously, there are lots of lines of work that have had this sort of existential question this past year of like, has the thing I've been doing with my life suddenly evaporated, or it disappeared. And again, I don't think in the long term it has. But it is strange to feel like, there's been this hiatus that's probably going to stretch on for a good while longer, and then wondering how everything's going to come back, just what the theater landscape is going to look like afterwards, for better and for worse. I do think there's ways in which theaters are adapting now that will probably for the better change what's produced and how it's produced in the future, but clearly so many smaller theater companies and individual artists I know who work at theaters have been let go and furloughed and everything. So, clearly right now it's pretty drastic for.
You've participated in some of the online performance, haven't you? Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you like that?
I've done a few readings of just like poetry and essays and that sort of thing. And then the one play, The House in Scarsdale that you mentioned, we were going to, or there were plans to do a New York off-Broadway production last summer that of course got scuttled. And so we did a rehearsed reading of it. And it was just a weird mix, probably like going to Zoom school or something, where like on one hand, it felt like performing again. We were rehearsing, we were talking about the script, we were trying to believably be a character and make a connection with the other character, and in theory there was an audience of, a few hundred people or a few thousand or whatever. So in that sense, it felt good. It felt like performance, but then you just had the usual Zoom fatigue of staring at a screen, and staring at yourself or trying not to stare at yourself. The delays that can happen. I mean, I love, there's that play, The House in Scarsdale. It's written in verse, but it's all derived from audio recordings. So talking about conversation as chaos with Gaddis, that's really interesting to me, because what I was trying to do with that play and with a few of my other plays was to really hone in on the improvised, chaotic, accidental ways in which we communicate, but also reveal ourselves, and so I don't know where I was going with that exactly, other than to say, a lot of the dialogue is actually quite quick, and that is harder to bounce back and forth with your actors.
Yeah,
that plays a little easier because there's two actors. We play different characters, but it's really just me and the other, because I was performing it, me and the other actor. Whereas I had a reading of a new play of mine, an in development play of mine, with a cast of 5 or something. And that was a bit more of a challenge to because they're listening to each other, then there's the delay, and then people are freezing a little bit. And
is that a dramatic pause, or are you lagging?
Exactly.
It's not in the script.
Yeah. So it's hard, I would imagine it. I'm sure people that are real stage actors and are doing these readings and performances all the time, I would imagine the challenge is like not to feel like a bad actor. I think even if you're a great actor, I would assume there's a lot of obstacles. Maybe a year in, they're used to it now, and they've mastered the medium.
I have to go back to teaching next week, and I'm like a little afraid of like going back to. I got used to it for a semester ish, and then it's been enough time for me not to think about it and to put that.
Yeah, I taught a workshop this summer, and it took me a while to get used to. I don't know if you had this experience, but just the fact that everyone's muted.
Oh my God, it fucking drives me insane. It's so goddamn quiet, and like they never like speak up. Yeah. I'm like laughing at my own jokes, and there's just silence. I'm like, ugh, eesh.
I felt like I was like dying on stage. Like anytime I made a joke, and then I'm like, thirstily looking around the screen to see if anyone's silently laughing, hoping that there's some response.
My students would always like turn off their camera too if they're gonna like drink or smoke weed, and then turn it back on. So like you'd like look, and there'd be like blank screens. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I saw this thing yesterday that was like peak COVID for me related to this, was that this kid on Twitter was like, he's in some school and he watched his first class on Zoom. It's Zoom class, whatever. And he went to email the professor and found out the professor was dead. The professor died in 2019 and they're just replaying his lectures. So there's he went to email him and found his obituary. And it's like, that's really like a new level of the simulacrum that we're living within.
Yeah. Yeah. That is grim. That is hilarious.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you're reading novels, maybe ones that aren't quite as heavy, like voice heavy as this one, do you read the dialogue and the character interactions and the sound of it with a playwright's ear? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I don't, to some degree, I'm sure I'll read some novel or short story and think, oh, maybe this dialogue sounds a bit formal or wooden or something. I mean, again, what's fantastic about this book is clearly Gaddis had this amazing ear for conversation. So, again, that's the sort of thing where often, I was reading it aloud at times because that was easier than reading it on the page. Actually putting it into your mouth and trying to speak the way we actually speak when we're conversing was easier than trying to read it on the page. And so, clearly with a lot of fiction, there's been that kind of, again, this happens on stage too, where to create naturalism, it's not really natural. It's something in between something formal and wooden and artificial and something more realistic. So I probably register that to some degree. I mean, my biggest thing about fiction, at least because I used to write short stories. I got a graduate degree in playwriting and fiction, and I really thought, okay, maybe I'm going to write novels or something.
For all the bucks, short stories.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But then I was tempted away by playwriting, the glitz and glamour of playwriting. But I did find, and this was like 15, 20 years ago, but I did find myself becoming impatient with description, which I've actually grown out of. But there was a period, in my 20s where I'd read a novel and I kind of would want to just read the dialogue or really read more distilled action of what's happening, as opposed to so much interior description of interior thoughts. And again, that's what's missing from this book, right? We don't have any character's interior world. No. And that is purely dramatic, right? I mean, with my students, if somebody is writing a play and they have long stage directions that are describing, or even short stage directions describing a character's inner state, I always say, no, you got to cut that because the audience won't see that. The audience won't hear that. You can do a little bit of that to sort of cheat for the first reader and to help actors and producers and directors. But for the most part, we take in what they're saying and what they're doing. And we're saying, oh, I know who that person is. I understand that type of person because of what they've said and done.
Right.
And that's exactly what he's doing here.
So interesting. Brian, I know you were going to ask, you wanted to talk about a particular, is it a French entrance? Am I remembering correctly?
French scenes.
French scenes, yeah.
Yeah. I'm really naive to it outside of what you can read on Wikipedia, basically. But it sounds like that's something very similar to what Gaddis is doing, where it's just talking and then the next character comes on and that's our transition. There's no changing of the and well, how would that work with a state? You would change the set or something to show a change in the scene?
I'm not sure of all, of a lot of probably the context of that. The way French scene has been sometimes used with me when I'm developing my plays is literally just, how to divide a play into sections of when a character leaves or arrives. So anytime there's a new constellation of characters, that's a new French scene.
Okay.
And one reason I think dramaturgs will do that when they're helping a company with sort of dissect the play, because, maybe there's 3 French scenes within this one scene. Mm-hmm. Or, maybe it's called Act 1, but within Act 1, there's 8 French scenes, And part of that is just to pull it apart. It helps in rehearsal because you can say, we only need these actors this day because we're going to work on Act 1 scene, French scene, 3 or 4. Again, you wouldn't need to do this if the playwright already kind of, notated the play that way.
Yeah.
But if you've got a more fluid script where characters are coming and going, and maybe the playwright has just written Act 1 or Part 1 or something like that, it can be really helpful. And I think, I think it was even an Elizabethan characteristic that the plays were just kind of unscrolled, that it was later editors essentially that divided the plays into acts and scenes. I'm not absolutely sure of that. I'm sure there was some amount of but because again, when Shakespeare wrote it, it wasn't primarily a literary creation. It was first just for the production. Kind of like, I guess, you read a screenplay and you don't have acts and scenes noted as such.
Yeah.
You have slug lines for different scenes, but you don't necessarily announce like we've reached the end of Act 1 and now there's a beginning of Act 2 and there's but as a screenwriter, you're thinking about that for sure, because that medium is obsessed with writing in a very prescriptive, structural way,
Yeah.
So yeah, French scene, but I thought a lot about that because that's what it is here, right? It's like, suddenly, sometimes it's because a character comes or goes, but sometimes it's because there's been one line of narration, or sometimes not at all, and we're just in another place.
Yeah. This is the first time in a while that I got confused over like who is talking. Is in the later section. We can go through the scenes a bit more chronologically in a second, but when it gets to the business part where the congressman, the woman who's in charge of the stock for her daughter, and the Beaton are there. I was like, I don't know who these people are all of a sudden. There's just so many voices. And I was like, they kept saying like her, they kept referring to her. And I was like, oh, so one of these is a female, but which female is it? But it was a character we had never met. And so it's like the first time that happens in so many pages that it like really threw me off. And then reading that, I was like, man, fuck business school, fuck business talk. But like that business talk. And then today I'm like reading about like stock option calls on GameStop through Reddit and how to manipulate stock prices and just take apart hedge funds. I was like, that's JR. Like these people are just JRing it. Yeah.
No, I was thinking about that too. I was already confused by what's happening with GameStop, but I was like, oh, that is what JR is about too. About
like sort of exposing penny stock difference.
Well, you could have easily just done chapters or scene headings in the book, and like would that have killed the vibe of it? Maybe a little bit, but he talks about it in here too with other characters. Like it's purposefully hard or difficult. And he's purposefully making there's going to be a small audience for this. And it's like, he knows it.
It's so funny. Really too. I tried to like make an argument this past weekend in this Delkey Archive newsletter thing that related to Bottom's Dream, which is literally unreadable in so many ways, was that like difficult literature isn't necessarily mean that it's hard, but means that you have to pay attention to things. And like this had that feeling then last night of like, I don't know what's going on, but it's like I have to pay attention now and figure out that this is a new character related to this. And what was interesting for me reading it this time is that I know Steve Moore's annotations exist. And like I could look at the scene and be like, oh, okay, here are the three voices. Now I know what's happening. But like when I read this years ago, it probably that existed, but I didn't know about it, and maybe it didn't. I had no idea. But like I just read it and was just like, fucking, I get so many people confused. Like the major, I always forget his last name. And Dan and Gibbs, I'd get confused, but now it's like a little bit easier to like.
No, you really do need, like you would in a play, the character page, with the dramatist personae, and probably a certain amount of synopsis because that's how I was cheating to figure out sometimes just to ground myself, especially when the shifts happened. I thinking like, I guess I could just read this for pages and pages and maybe pick up 5% of it. or I could Google it and get a little bit more information and get 60% of it or something. But that's great. That's exciting. I remember the first time I read Chekhov, especially in translations where they use the actual Russian naming system, where it's like, you need a lot of help but again, if you see a good production of it, it can be crystal clear and you can actually understand what the big deal is about Chekhov,
I want to get into these scenes for sure, but there's one other thing that when you mentioned about the natural sounding dialogue and how that's sort of in between naturalism and like artifice. That seems to run parallel to what we talk about for translations, in terms of like translations seeming that they're like a third language. It's never quite English or the original. It's its own sort of translation ease, which can be treated as a negative thing. But at certain points in time, that's the way that it sort of flows. And when we do it, like most of the editing that happens with the translations that we work on is fixing the dialogue, because it's always comes off as being wooden very quickly. And that seems to be one of the key points where people just like, nope, this sounds like a translation. I'm not going to read it anymore.
Right. I would imagine, that would be the case for sure. And I'm trying to adapt right now a book for, I mean, again, this is the hopeless optimism of playwrights, that I'm adapting a book for the stage.
Nice.
For a stage that may not exist. But it's a book set in Scotland, and I'm not Scottish. So, and I've spent a certain amount of time over there, and in the book, it has Scottish people speaking, but the memoir is written by an American. So I think the dialogue's pretty good. So anyway, so I have a great deal of anxiety about that, and at a certain point, maybe I'll just beg anyone Scottish to read the script and try to help me, because very small things, as you're saying in translation, very tiny, subtle things can sound inauthentic, you know?
Right.
But that's again why, I mean, clearly Gaddis had an amazing ear. You do wonder, like sometimes, like it did seem like all of the captains of industry, for lack of a better term, were the same person.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And like, so, and that's another question, which is how much did he have to push or want to push his characters to caricature in order to be entertaining, clearly, but also for clarity's sake. Do you know what I mean? Like, and this is somewhat going against what I just said, but if each character has very broad, verbal ticks and tells, in some ways that's much easier to follow who's speaking, right? If you're not going to say Bob said or Jim said, or, you have to have a very specific way of speaking for each character.
Right.
But so, yeah, I'd be curious how much, I mean, I also got obsessed with, what just the how he's the punctuation he's using.
Yeah.
In terms of how dialogue is used. I mean, maybe this is really silly and simple, but the M dash is huge for a playwright, like or a screenwriter. You can overuse it, of course, but just especially if it's naturalism, we interrupt ourselves, we correct ourselves, we do it in such a way that the listener kind of corrects with us, so that they hear what we've just said in a way that probably makes more sense than if you transcribed what we just said.
Right.
But he can't use the M dash because he's using that to announce dialogue.
Yeah.
So he's using commas often.
And a lack of commas a lot of times.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times when you're saying like reading it out loud made it make more sense. That happens to me every time that I go to, when we try and read passages on here, it happens. But even like at other points of time when I'm writing something out, I notice that there's missing commas that I need to like splice it to make that next part make sense. Right. Or I'll read past it and hit the wrong note.
Yeah. And that was interesting to me in that, of course I've written lots of dialogue where I'm using commas very non-traditionally, but I'll sometimes use commas a little bit traditionally just for clarity's sake.
Yeah.
And he's not doing that whatsoever. So again, this is another way in which it feels like completely balls to the wall, purist. This is how he's hearing it. This is how these characters speak. It does make a lot of the characters seem completely breathless.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like headlong, toppling, coked up, whatever it is, but they're, and often they have good reason to be in this section, it's kind of when I guess the first section is the section with Gibbs and
Gibbs and Eigen. Yeah, I love that part. So this is one of those interesting episodes too, where we don't have too many of the different scenes. There's only like a handful this time and they sort of like breathe a bit. I guess there's like 3 really, right? Gibbs and Eigen in the office is an interlude to get to the congressman and the woman and the lawyer, and then Crowley talking to Bast. And that's basically the three main parts of this section. And they also sort of relate to one another, but the Eigen Gibbs section is hilarious.
Oh yeah.
Like, so yeah, this is the one where like basically to recap, like Eigen's wife has left him. Gibbs and Eigen were at like Schramm's apartment, like dealing with like the estate or whatever. And they're coming back down and they're going to stay at Eigen's old apartment. And Gibbs is like sloshed out drunk like he usually is, like completely gone, incapable of doing anything. They're drinking something that's just called like fake liquor, I believe. It's just like liquor in a bottle from the airport. And he keeps complaining about divorce and about like everything that's gonna happen with like, well, you're never gonna see your kid. Like visitation will be 2 hours. You're standing up there acting like you have to leave. And she knows that you don't have to leave, but you're pretending you do because that's all you get because the judge said it's 2 hours. And as a divorced man, I do recognize this a little bit. It feels a little bit close to home.
This part on 429.
What's that?
Let me read this part on 429.
Yes.
We were talking about sound. I thought this sounded so good. I'm at the bottom of 429. Tom, got a boy here selling greeting cards. What grade are you in? 6M, Mrs. Menzel. Tom, boy out here working his way through 6N selling greeting cards. What's the greetings? Well, see, these are all occasion cards, like for all different occasions. They're all occasion cards, Tom. Got them for all different occasions, like birthday, anniversary, all those different occasions. Like, got a friend who jumped out a window. Got a card for that? Well, gee, maybe can't get well. Went home and hung himself. Got a card for that? Well, gee, I don't think so, but maybe you could. Got a woman on alimony sleeping with a book salesman. Hell of an occasion. Got a card for that? And just hitting them and hitting them.
I marked the very beginning of the where the kid knocks on the door and he's like, "Hi, is Mrs. Eigen here?" And he's like, "I'll order them." That's fucking
But I get the feeling Gaddis had a couple in on when he was on this section, was just on a roll. Like I could so much energy. He was really had a smile type of smile.
And it's so even though that sequence is just funny on the surface, funny dialogue.
Heartbreaking.
It's also heartbreaking. It's also like inappropriate. You're like, he's saying this to this kid, and of course Eigen calls him on that and is like, just gives him some money and gets him out of there. And but yeah, it's heartbreaking, which I think makes it so much more interesting. That the stakes are, it's a question that I had throughout the novel, was just thinking as a playwright again, because playwrights have to sort of think like poets. I know novelists do this too, but in terms of like every single interaction in theory should be pretty high stakes, between the characters, or maybe internally if the character's grappling with something internal. And this is a really interesting scene dramaturgically, because I guess what's really happening is pretty much an internal conflict that's coming out in these darkly comic ways,
Yeah.
Because in terms of any actual conflict, what Eigen wants Gibbs to shut up, to go to bed, to not traumatize the kid. Whose idea? And it's Gibbs's idea to talk about Divorce, the board game, right?
Yes, which is genius, because then it shows up and he's like, "What was that $1 million idea?" And Eigen's like, "You didn't know. You were just talking these two fucking racehorses. If you had a $1 million idea, I'll write it down." He's like, "No, really, there was something. And Baby Jeter and the Three Wide Men, so good.
That they're using the crash as the game pieces.
Divorce the board game would be awesome. One of the first book fairs I went to for the first Book Expo America was in Los Angeles, and I was working for Delkey and had all these Delkey books on display. It's in like the Staples Center or wherever we were, and it's not there, whatever, the LA Convention Center, and all these people are walking through, and there's a mixture of like people bookstores trying to know about things. But at that point in time, back in like the early 2000s, there were a lot of writers that would go and try and find publishers for their manuscripts. And so this woman came up, looks at this table of like strangely experimental books, all over the place, looks at the name, is like, "I've got a book for you. It's called The Divorce Handbook. You bundle it in parts of 5 for when you're getting a divorce, you buy it and you get 5 copies of it and you give it to all your friends so they know what you're going through." And I was like, we are never going to publish your book. But you know what would be awesome is a divorce TV channel. Like a TV channel is just like celebrity divorces and like divorce court and like just like all sorts of like amazing like cops on taking down like deadbeat dads, like all divorce related stuff. I would eat that shit up. And she's like, no. Like walked away.
She's like, no, that's not my idea. So no.
Like, sorry, you're not gonna be.
Wait, she had one book, but you would buy 5 copies of it.
5 copies.
Your friends.
Kind of genius, you know.
I mean, I would love to do that with any book, right? You have to buy 5 copies. You can't buy one.
No, it's $3 per book, or $15.
You're required to buy 5 and give it to friends, like a pyramid scheme. And if they like it, they have to buy 5.
They're tracks, they're not books, and you can pass them out to more than 5 if you want.
I hope this isn't a horrible tangent, but one of my first playwriting commissions, which I wanted to talk about in terms of Bast writing his commissioned music, one of my first commissions right out of, literally a month after grad school was writing the book for a musical, a prospective musical by somebody who was a woman who was writing something she called Divorce of Course, ! And I would come over. I was going to grad school at Brown. So she lived in Providence as well. And I would walk over to her house at night, and she would play me because she'd already written the music. It was very non-standard. Usually the book is written first and you kind of grow the music out of the story, but she had this selection of comical, but clearly came from the pain of her own divorce, songs about divorce. And her daughter, she had like a 10-year-old daughter who obviously resented my presence in the home. So she would bust in, every 10 minutes to give her mom attitude about, snacks or something. And I think the woman was kind of flirting with me. So that made it weird with the daughter. And it was terrible, but it had a lot. Yeah. It reminded me, Divorce, the board game, reminded me of Divorce, of Course. It went nowhere. Eventually I left Providence and I said, she was paying me very little money, but it was a commission.
Yeah.
So but I said, I'll give you the money back. And she said, no, she's like, just write something, just finish it, just write something. So I wrote something very quickly and I was able to keep the money, but I insisted that she use a pseudonym.
Oh, nice.
If Divorce, of Course, ever gets out there, you'll know it was me. I did a horrible job. So
that's amazing. All of that, all these stories. Now that I think about them too, I've been reading a lot of Martin Amis books, but they remind me of like a Martin Amis setup where there's always like someone that's having to write the play version of like some other story or whatever. That's how Brian, I came across London Field's movie yesterday, which has a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Wait, which movie?
London Fields. Based on the Martin Amis book, came out in 2018 with Amber Heard and has a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh my God.
The John Depp thing at that time.
Have you watched it?
No, I didn't even know it existed until yesterday. It had the second worst opening weekend in box office history.
God.
Wow. Impressive.
Did you read, I was a little of my Google sleuthing. I saw that at least somewhere, maybe in the letter, Gaddis had talked about sort of dreaming of Robert Altman directing.
Did he really?
Yeah, directing his version.
I the other week. I was like, he would be perfect for this.
And it makes sense as some sort of influence, maybe at the time, or maybe he just recognized that that they were sort of opening sensibilities, with the dialogue, casts not to mention a huge amount of dialogue, but I don't know. Who knows? That could have been more of a, because you do wonder. I don't know how you would adapt this. The part of when I first started reading it, a week and a half ago, I thought to myself, God, this would be like somebody should adapt this as a play. Make it like a 7-part play or whatever it would be, And then, of course, a few days later, I thought, oh, but that'll probably, end in tears and bankruptcies. But maybe, maybe the right writer with stars in it. Who knows? Because some of this is obviously so hilarious and so apropos to So I don't know.
I couldn't figure out, like, when we talked about this briefly earlier, I think it might have been last week, Brian, but like how the difficult, like if you could make a multi-season like TV show of it, even there's the problem of like, what is your conflict that keeps this together? Like, what are you following? What is and like part of like the funniness and the fact that it's like a 12-year-old like upending this bank and like taking over all these crazy companies, like the beer company that's getting people sick with their cobalt, and like, which is sort of alluded to, and then getting Matchbox or the Matchbook company to print things, and then all that kind of stuff. It's like very funny, but it feels like if you started to go down that road, the natural tendency would make it into one of those terrible movies where it's like Baby Genius or whatever, that like ends up like baby boss or boss baby. That's what it is. Boss baby.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, when I'm teaching, quote unquote, teaching playwriting, always the first question is like, is there a protagonist, right? Is there like one character we follow? Clearly, I mean, there isn't. So, I mean, maybe you could, but I think a screenplay would be tempted to try to make a protagonist or somebody who's more of a protagonist.
Like Bast, perhaps?
Which I think would be Bast, yeah.
Yeah.
It would have to be
kind of naive-ish and navigating this weird, and everybody else around is like larger than life, right?
Yeah, and that he's trying to, what is his overall objective, right? I mean, it's to create art, is to be pure and true to himself, and
get something pretty.
Yeah, and to survive financially while he's doing it, and then JR becomes this kind of like, as he is in The Ring, this kind of like impish, devilish, demonic. Quasi-antagonist, even though he's partnering with him, Right. So I mean, maybe that could. I mean, clearly it would change, the structure, or you would approach it as just like a Robert Altman film, and it's something where it really is an ensemble,
right?
Piece.
Interesting, though. It really is. The idea to get, we have the letters of William Gaddis are in my office, and every week I'm like, oh, I should pull that out and see like what's in there that relates to this episode, but I'm never in my office. So it's sitting there, and one of these weeks I will remember to look at it.
I feel like each week we get a new encounter where commerce is just destroying the artist. In each scene you're seeing that, and I really like the way it came out in this section we covered with the mural.
Right.
And just the absolute like larger than life debacle that was.
So I had a question about that for both of you. That well, not really a question, but an observation. So it's interesting that Schramm is also an artist, correct? Mm-hmm. He's not a visual artist, but he helps them. He was writing, doing something, and he killed himself. And then that guy's name is like also begins with an S, SCH version 2, isn't it?
Yeah.
Shama or something, and it's like comes up so quickly thereafter, and he's also like a train wreck, like at the, what do they call them, the White Roses bars all the time, and they're trying to find him, and he shows up at the office and is flipping out. Like those two characters seem, maybe this is my question, is are they supposed to be like the kind of pure artistic genius side of this, of that sort of, they don't get a win, they both lose, but they both retain like this anger against that corporate side of things, and this sort of like, I don't know, I didn't know what to make of that, but it's weird that they come up so quickly, like one after the other. One's just killed himself, and then we finally understand what the painting reference is from like 300 pages earlier.
Right.
And it's almost like the doubling of that motif again, because there's so many like motifs in here, and you'll see like the reflections and the back and forth, and that one's just so on top of itself that it seemed a little bit strange or like worth noting.
Well, yeah, they do. They seem to be, I mean, that's how I took it too. The sort of examples of, again, for lack of a better word, pure artists who are destroyed for being pure, or by trying to be pure. And it's kind of interesting that we're seeing, so many permutations of that same predicament, in different characters and different ways in which they're trying to survive as artists in this chaos of capitalism, or this insanity of capitalism. I mean, I personally loved it's so short, but the little interaction at the office with is it Eigen or Egan? Eigen,
sure.
And okay, Eigen and the playwright, of course, I was interested in that. It's very quick.
This is so funny.
So funny. So
What's that?
funny.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the exact page here. But they, what's great?
444,
442. I think it starts.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it starts with like I love how the playwright is it Gall, I think is his name, which is interesting.
Who appeared earlier, but we didn't know who he was then.
Okay.
So he is, just to frame this, he is the character that at the very beginning, when the foundation is coming to the school and they're in the school principal's office and all the crazy shit's happening, and Bast reads the wrong text from Miss Fleisch or whatever and gets himself fired. That's the guy that's there to write the book on the success experiment. And he references it here, but he is in that very first scene. Gall exists there, but that's the only time he comes up, and then he comes up, literally 330 pages later.
Right. Yeah, I just love how he right away accidentally insults Egan by saying, clearly you were, good. What's the exact phrase? You were writing for a small audience.
Yes.
But you must have known when you were writing it. You must have known you're writing for a very small audience. Small audience. His feet dropped. Do you think I would have worked on it for 7 years just for? Do you know what my last royalty check was, Mr. Gall? Mr. Gall, $53.52. The publisher dropped it cold the day it came out. He must think I wrote it for a very small audience too. And it's great because you can hear that he's not only upset, but he's also trying to make a joke out of it. And that's all coming, with the exception of the feet dropping. That's all coming from dialogue, Oh
my God. I love this part. And I love that it leads into, so this is another one of these doubling motif things, is that it leads into 448, where they're talking about Mr. Skinner's book company, and they're showing him the most recent catalog, and don't sit there waving it. Give it to me. Told you one business we're not going broke in is the damn book business, didn't I? Looked over their operating statement, paying 10% for overhead, 10 for their money, 10 for warehousing, 10 for sales and jobbers, 10 for these damn royalties. Bookstore reps and bookstore steps in, takes 50% off the top, sends back what they don't sell, leaves you with it in one hand, and here's, wait, what's this, their list? It's that is publishing. Yep. Also big failure. So you have the artist who's they never did anything for my book, and it was for a very small audience. And then you have the publishing scene that's this shit doesn't work.
Right.
It just sort of doesn't work. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's the nightmare. It's sort of your nightmare vision of the conversation that publishers would be having about your book, or
or with their funders.
Right. See what you can get for a nickel in a used bookstore. Why any damn fool wants to add another one to the heap? I mean, this is just brutal but funny.
So funny. There's a friend, I think I may have mentioned this before. I have a friend, Ed Nowatka, who used to want to start a book review called Future Remainders, and would just evaluate whether something would be remaindered and how quickly it would be remaindered.
Well, when I lived in New York, especially, I would do playwriting workshops at theaters, at their offices. And usually that meant that you were given a table in the room where the dramaturgs worked. Mm-hmm. And the dramaturgs are people that probably the only people that read scripts that come in, except for the scripts that then maybe go on to production. So, so I just found it so depressing to walk into these rooms with 500 scripts just sitting there. Some probably have been there for years. Yep. And just reminded, I mean, it's somewhat what I felt when I moved to LA, and you walk into any coffee store before COVID, coffee shop. Every laptop has got Final Draft open.
Yeah.
And it's everybody is working on either TV script or film script, Again, that's kind of wonderful. In some ways, I think that's better because LA at least I feel can support a lot of writers financially who are doing that. Whereas you go into a theater office and you see how many people are writing plays for how few opportunities, and how an off-Broadway production, pays, even at a very well-known off-Broadway theater, pays very little. The only one who's going to make money is if you have something go to Broadway and run for a long time.
Right. Like Hamilton, right, Brian?
Yeah, I've never seen it. I got this hat for $1 because I own.
Yeah, that did all right. I think that was pretty successful.
Heard of it?
Yeah.
I love it. Like, yeah, it's great.
I taught I did a 1-day playwriting workshop in New York years ago for like a 6-hour workshop. And it was kind of great because it was like anybody could take it. It was through Gotham Writers Workshop. If you've ever heard of Gotham,
Yeah.
Like right out of grad school, I had this job. So people could just pay $300 or something to take it. It was all day. Halfway through the day, I said, "Oh, let's take a few minutes to just introduce yourself and give a little more context about why you want to write plays." And this guy, he says, "Hi, I'm Bernie or whatever, and I just want to write a play because I have an idea and I want to make some good money." And and in a very gentle way, I said, "Oh, that's great, but playwriting, maybe screenwriting, maybe TV writing, but playwriting, you're not going to make a lot of money." He literally, we still had a little bit more of the break. He literally just left for the day. He just didn't come back. I guess he took my advice, but he was like, "Oh, I'm in the wrong room. This is the wrong workshop."
Even in the workshop that prints money.
Yeah. But it's all the same. I mean, what's interesting about this, whether it's publishing, theater, and TV and film, I'm sure it's just a question of zeros. Do you know what I mean? It's still all the same types of considerations about what's going to be commercial, what's going to have some sort of critical success, maybe for a different type of currency, I think about that a lot because the theater, of course, is not nearly as expensive as TV and film.
Yeah.
But it's in some ways just as competitive and difficult. And again, TV and film, you could have a bad experience writing something, but you've been paid enough to live.
Mm-hmm.
The theater, you can spend a lot of time writing something and get paid absolutely nothing.
It's even like, it's one of the weird, like the scale of things is so hard to like, I think about this in terms of my students. So like one of the first things for the students for the publishing class that I teach each semester, they read part of this one book where it talks about the different capital that you can have, like the sales part of it, but there's also cultural capital. There's the reasons that you publish things that aren't going to make money, but give you that sort of sheen because of like the critical success or whatever it might be, and like how that plays into decision-making. And then I'll try and explain to them like, how many copies a book sells versus other media. And like the numbers are so different and like so wildly, it is a matter of zeros, but those zeros seem extreme. So like when a show gets canceled and they're like, well, it was only like 1.5 million viewers. And it's like, we've never sold 1.5 million books in the existence of everything that we've ever done put together doesn't equal that of like the last episode of this show.
Right. Well, how do you think? I mean, my wife works in TV, as you know, Chad, and she's had a couple of her own shows. And so I've gone through that experience with her where she had her first show that she created and starred in was on NBC. And this was back when it's changed. But at the time, you did need to get like 1.5 million viewers. And it wasn't getting that. It was probably getting, 900,000 or something,
Right.
Which again, to me was like incredible, astronomical, mind blowing, and again, because cable has changed everything, shows can stay on for a long time. We're getting 500,000 and it's a different situation. But yeah, and then I think the opposite side of the spectrum, it would be poetry where, it's like
7.
Like I read somewhere not too long ago that even a very well-established, well-known poet and a pretty major poetry publisher, they're still thinking maybe 500 copies sold is a good run.
That came up with the Louise Gluck Nobel Prize thing, was that the Spanish publisher lost the rights to her books because of her agent, and they had been keeping them in print forever. But they're like, but even though she won the Nobel Prize, we sold like 600 copies.
Right.
Like,
it's still poetry.
Still poetry. Says a poet. You're allowed to say that, I suppose.
Yeah. No, and on one hand, I love it. And I think that's, again, why I connect so much to these characters. Because there's this, whether it's the martyr instinct or something masochistic, or maybe it is something pure. It's all of those things, but it's like, it brings up those big questions about why create anything, and for what reason.
Yeah.
Because, I've never been able to think commercially and creatively at the same time, and sometimes in very small ways, a play of mine has done better than another play or something, but I certainly didn't set out to do that.
Right. And you've won the Penn Award twice, right? Am I misremembering that?
Yeah. And that's like, I mean, it's kind of a weird, it's a Penn. It used to be called something else. But basically, it's for plays produced west of the Mississippi.
Right. And I was on the committee. That's why we are not on your committee, but on the translation committee. And that's how we met at the gala. But I could the life of me never remember what the name of that Penn thing was. So every time I've written about it, I'm like West Penn, Penn West,
It
USA
used to
Penn,
be Penn West, I think, and then it became Penn, the Penn USA Award. It was Penn USA with the first time I won it, and then this time we were calling Penn America.
And that's
that doesn't spell out that it really, for plays at least, it was for plays premiered west of the Mississippi, which I just love that distinction.
Yeah. It's like there used to be, have you ever heard the late night talk show host Art Bell when he was on, like the conspiracy theorist, not QAnon conspiracy theory, but aliens.
Like Bigfoot and aliens. And
Bigfoot and aliens. He was a
huge fan.
Greatest late night talk show ever. But he'd always be like, west of the Rockies. We're calling west of the Rockies now, east of the Rockies. That was his dividing line. Like the Rockies were some sort of like spiritual midpoint of America. West of the Rockies was one sort of color, east of the Rockies was another.
Yeah. And that's probably very true. There's a certain amount of... Brian, where are you? What part of the country are you in, Brian?
I'm in Atlanta.
You're in Atlanta, okay.
Yeah.
You're your own part of the country.
Yeah, the Southeast. I mean, you're in the capital of the Southeast.
I don't know. It's all weird everywhere. I live in a gay neighborhood in the shadow of Stone Mountain, basically. So it's just, life is weird. I like it. I wouldn't want it any other way, I guess.
I guess there is one other scene that might be worth mentioning. So Bass does his, like, that part's really funny because he's written out the score and he's like, well, you need to perform it for me because I can't read this shit. And he's like, well, I can't perform it for an orchestra that's like 95. He's like, no, I don't understand. You need to be able to do this. You need to focus on one thing. Stop it. Focus on this. And like sort of articulates JR's scam. There's some point I marked in here last night when I was reading that. I feel like this is the moment where JR fucked up. And I don't remember what it was now. And I'm not sure if my notes make any sense. They usually don't. But I think there's one point where like in here, like it sort of indicates that he may have overplayed his hand now in terms of like acquiring these companies basically as tax write-offs, but not having the capital. And they're trying to sell them the capital part to make it work. But I also, again, don't really understand all the business talk in here.
Yeah.
Like I know it in theory, but like these numbers are insane. And like the way they talk about it is insane.
It would be interesting to get some kind of, real business head to read this book, I mean, because I'm the same way. Like when it gets to talking about, buying and selling, and I pretty much glaze over and I'm just kind of reading it for the just to listen to it,
I found it. I didn't mark it, but it says like this hedging he's starting recently in commodities futures. It can be a little risky played that close to the margins. This might be a good time to stop and pick up your winnings. Snap up this offer on the power company site's mining claims, and the rest of it may not be there next time you look. And I should tell you, Bess, this man Stamper's not one to play with. He plays to win, blah, blah, blah. But there feels like that's the moment where like it's extended and it's constantly like taking an asset, taking whatever was there to buy another asset to use as a write-off. Everything that loses money is just being written off against each other, but nothing's making any money. There's no like source.
So this was like the first place where you felt like, oh, maybe this house of cards is going to come down.
It's going to come down. That's where I thought there. And it's sort of related to like the little bit I can understand about this Reddit thing is that all they're doing is buying like options on. So you have the option of they're buying options to buy stock at a certain price. So you say like, oh, when the price hits $20, I'm going to buy this stock. But like if it's going up, you can sell that, if it's beyond that and you're available to buy it at $20 far into the future, you're able to sell that for like a lot of money. Mm-hmm. It's a valuable commodity. And it feels like that sort of hedging and anti-hedging sort of options. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but they're crazy. But there is a scene in the school at the end where it's clear that the pictures of the naked pictures have gotten reversed with the school, the pictures for the annual report, because the annual report one also has where people are one of the students is made to look like they're black so that they have diversity, which was referenced way earlier, where the one person's like, don't you have any diverse kids in your class? They're like, well, we can just make this one look a little bit more black. And they say that a lot about the image of Bast and the guy up at Eagle Mills. We're like, oh, it's like two black people. And they're like, no, it's just bad quality. And like this sort of like fuzzing of like identity and race in this is really interesting because it does fit in with that corporate America way of like doing that. But there's the part where like the major's son, who's going to play the, you know, in the ring, play like the whatever the call and be whatever he is. He is showing everyone his naked pictures because he's been sending away for shit through the mail to get like nudie photos to be popular at school, which reminded me weirdly of, I met this guy once who went to school with Barney Rossett, who ran Grove Press, founded Grove Press.
Oh, yeah.
Barney Rossett's son. And he's like, Barney Rossett's son was like by far the most popular person at the school. So he'd be like, hey guys, I've got so much porn. Like I've got so much, like it is just everywhere in my house. We have obscene things constantly. I'll bring it to school. Was the most popular kid ever because his dad was Barney Rossett.
Yeah, was he getting it from France? Was it European porn coming?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And like all the books that like Barney would publish, where he'd be like, I hope they sue me over this because it's obscene, and they'd get sued and be like, sold 1 million copies.
Well, and that whole section is so interesting, of course, because now we live in an age where porn is like everywhere.
Yeah,
and we're of course growing up. When we grew up, it was like you had to find it, you know, like a waterlogged Playboy in somebody's flooded garage, you know. And
I had a friend who stuffed the Vanna White Playboy in like the drop-down ceiling of his basement, and it was up there with Vanna White in it. I remember this very specifically from like 7th grade, going over to his house and being like, "Oh my god!" But like, also we'd find shit in the woods. I always found like
it was always in the woods. Yeah, I've
what was happening?
That too. I don't know. Yeah, I wonder, was it like kids who would look at it and, you know, and then like in a fit of shame, like abandon it? Or was it like they couldn't hide it at home?
Or was it like us? Like then, like us now are like, well, at that point in time, you didn't have the internet or like privacy. So you just like go to the woods with your Playboy and then leave it for kids to find.
Yeah. Yeah, just leave it for the next one person, the next sex-starved pubescent kid to come along. No, I remember one of my earliest memories with magazines, dirty magazines, as we call them, was a kid who I wasn't even friends with, but I came over to his house. I think we were like 6 years old, 7 years old. We were very young. And he said, and he was into building things in his basement with like scrap wood and stuff. And so maybe we were a little older, maybe, but he also had his dad's like cache of Playboys and penthouses down there. And he said to me, and I remember asking him, I said, hey, do you think I could borrow one of these? Because, and this was my excuse, I said, my older brother's home and he's got a really bad cold. And I know this would cheer him up. This would really make him feel better.
Oh my God.
And my friend said, okay, I'll let you borrow this issue. But first it's my mother's birthday. So you have to help me build her I think it was like a battleship or something out of wood.
Oh my God.
So like we spent the morning building some kind of wooden structure for his mother. And then I was leaving the house with the Playboy tucked into my shirt. My mother standing in the doorway. The kid's mother is zipping up my jacket and finds the magazine and pulls it out in front of my mother. And I mean, it must have been, I don't remember feeling that embarrassed, but so who knows if I really understood it. But I remember getting in the car. So my mother took me out to the car. My dad was in the car. She must have said something to my dad. And the only thing my dad said was, he said, who's the founder of Playboy? I'm blanking on his name.
Hugh Hefner.
Hugh Hefner. He goes, yeah, Hugh Hefner. Very, very smart man. Very smart man. And that's all he said about it. That was probably my entire sex talk for all of my childhood.
That's amazing. I used to meet with the people from Playboy regularly, the fiction and review editors. They were amazing. Amy Grace Lloyd was in charge at that time of fiction, and Lee, what's Lee's last name? He still does. He works on and he's still involved in publishing and in magazines. But
well, yeah, they were fiction
real reviews.
Powerhouse. Oh, they wrote reviews too?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Our Open Letters' very first book got reviewed in Playboy.
And what do they do? They exist now. I know they stopped publication for a while, but they remained an internet publication, right?
Sure. I have no idea. That one, I remember like when everything changed and both of them left. Like and then I was like, oh, I don't know anyone there. But like, we would go out to like really fancy lunches. Like they would take me out to fancy lunches because they had the Playboy credit card and I was pitching them books.
And that was, I remember even in college, everyone was like, in grad school too, you know, get your short story in Playboy magazine. That was up there with the New Yorker or the Atlantic or something, you know?
Yeah. I think that her last acquisition was Nabokov's Origin of Laura, was to get the exclusive rights to publish an excerpt from that in Playboy. And then it turned out, but they wouldn't let her see it before they made the offer. Like that was part of the agent's deal, was that they knew that it wasn't a real book and that it wasn't good. And so they sold it sight unseen and drove up like a huge bidding war. And then they published it and it was garbage. And I think that was basically the end of her time at Playboy.
Oh, wow.
This is tying together a lot of weird threads. Anyway, we should probably wrap this one up. The other thing to mention is that Clancy is dead. I forget who Clancy was, but he killed himself in his car in the woods where they're going to put the community art center. And that's a really funny scene too, where they're like, the fucking guy, the guy that's running for Senate or for councilman or whatever he's doing, that just like blacktops everything. Yeah. And like they tore down all the trees and he just blacktopped it. And there's this guy dead in a car. And like, do you want his Oldsmobile? It still kind of smells like
smell. Yeah, that's where they're talking about. That's so macabre. It's so funny.
Do you have a favorite line from here, Dan? From this section?
Favorite? I mean, there were so many. I love that sequence with Dahl for sure. And that one, you know, we've run out of time, but the extended conversation between Bast and Crawley, I think is just so funny and painful, and also just so accurate. Yeah, you know, in terms of how I'm sure, you know, every artist has had conversations like this with people who are paying you to write, you know, to write something to hire. And especially if it's somebody that's not even remotely connected to the art. You know, it's one thing if they're kind of a development executive or something, but if it's someone who's just got the money and has ridiculous ideas about art and wants you to create something, I just love that sequence, and just that queasy feeling that Bast is obviously experiencing, where you need this person, so you have to put up with it and you have to flatter that person, but they're so full of shit. And I mean, as a playwright, I've just had so many experiences like that with benefactors.
Related to what you're saying, like, because that rings true as like an artist. It also rings true like within the cultural sphere at all, where you're just constantly like, hey, we need some money to publish these books. And they're like, why? Why don't you just publish more popular books? And you're like, well, that's not really how this works. Like, you know, you're spending all this money on these, like, just come on, man, give me $10,000. But Bast also, when we're talking about the interiority of the characters, he weirdly is very much a cipher. Like, what is Bast wants to make this great work of art, his cantata that he keeps talking about, but he's always caught up in things and he rarely speaks. Like, he's always interrupted. He's always like, no, wait, like, and they're like, shut up, man. Like, just make the thing. He's like, but that, and they're like, no, it's fine. That's what we want. He's like, maybe I found a piano. No, not a piano. Like, he never gets to like finish himself. Like, he's like a really weird. So if he were like the protagonist of like a play version or a TV version, it's weird because he's almost no one. He has a check that we don't know how much money it's for. It's either $15,000 or 15 cents, but it was miscalculated either way, that they reference in here too, from like the foundation. Like, everything's like off about him and also like sort of mysterious.
Right.
His shit happens off screen because he goes up to Union Falls and meets with all those people. We never see that. We only hear that like he was taken to a softball game into like the Elks Lodge.
And I wonder because he survives, right? Spoiler alert. I mean,
I think so.
Like, I wonder if in a certain way he
doesn't write his cantata either. Like,
yeah, it's true. But doesn't, I mean, at least in one of the synopses I read, you know, doesn't the piece he's writing keep getting like simplified, right? It keeps getting sort of and dwindled down, but like he does still create something. And I wonder if there's some kind of like ironic victory in that, like the fact that he's kind of a cipher, you know, maybe allows him to survive. He's sort of buffeted along through all of this chaos and can arrive at the end with something. I don't know.
Interesting enough, like someone commented on the last week's episode saying, I love when you guys make predictions about what's going to happen to people. And because this person's like, I just reread the whole book, like, recently. So it's very funny to see like where you are and like what you're guessing at. And that's perfect. Cause like we do it all the time in here. And I don't remember, like I read this book the last time in like 2003. That's so many years ago in my world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it must be so interesting because I imagine, because we're the same age, like I was much different. My point of view on art and business was, of course, much different now than it was then.
Yep.
I would imagine it'd be such a different reading experience.
It's very fun. Like it's really like a highlight of the week is to like sit down and read this for like a couple days, like in the morning with coffee and in the evening. Like love it. And like before, I think it was a badge of honor bit to it that there isn't now.
And I would imagine, he was when Gaddis wrote it, he was certainly middle-aged. There's a certain middle of life, middle of career perspective that's inherent in this book. I would imagine his first book was very much like the prodigy young writer explosion of synapses firing and brilliance, but also overwhelming. This has kind of a certain amount of wisdom, irony, jaundice point of view, absurd humor. No, it's great. I feel bad I had to skip ahead, but it's obviously
that's the best. That's actually how we literally used to do the podcast this way. Like with the first books that we did, people would only read the section that they were going to talk about, and it was wild. Like the connective tissue was only our experience. But Brian, do you have a favorite line?
Yeah, I read mostly what I liked a lot. I'll read this one line since it pertains to drama, and it's that poor Gaul character trying to share a little bit about the play he'd written. He starts at the top of page 444. I've already written the first act. Came on behind me on the door, but somebody who read it said the trouble with my main character. And then there's this huge interruption, and then like all the way down, like a third from the bottom. Anyway, he said the trouble with my main character coming right on stage and telling all about himself before anybody in the audience is interested in him at all. And thank you, Missy, and then just go cut off after that.
Yeah, I love that too. Because I'm sure I've done that myself, and we'll do that.
Who hasn't? Who hasn't?
Since I've been leaning into reading the very porny lines, and since we talked about Playboys, my favorite line for this week is 487. Looks like she's working up a frothy little selection on the old licorice stick. Nothing fancy about that.
Oh my God. I feel like I circled lots of favorites, so maybe I should find one too.
That's one that we can't laugh at, except that I agree. But that was one where I was typing that out and I was like, man, this shit, like if there's no commas here, I was going to send it to you, Brian, like out of nowhere, but like the commas are all wrong.
Yeah, I look forward to those 11 to 1 a.m. texts of just random. Oh, that's got to be a Gaddis line. This makes no sense. What is this?
I think, like on 475, I don't know if this really works as just a one line, but like, when Crowley says, and of course you realize I can't pay you anything on this little project. After like forcing him to listen to all this garbage, or when he accuses Bast of having an almost unhealthy preoccupation with money.
That's perfect.
Yep.
You're spreading yourself a bit too thin. Just the criticism, what Crowley obviously believes is like good, well-intended, constructive criticism, and how it's just, galling on many levels is amazing.
So good. So Dan, people can find you online you're Dan O'Brien writer on Twitter, right?
Yes, there's many Dan O'Briens and many Dan O'Brien writers. But I am at Dan O'Brien writer on Twitter.
The Dan O'Brien that I remember is the Dan and Dave.
Yes, and I still get that. Sometimes I'll be checking into a hotel and they'll say, how's the decathlon treating you? And
what's Reebok up to these days?
Yeah, and I go, ha ha.
Yeah,
no, I've been working on a prose poem that will probably never be published, but just about all the other Dan O'Briens.
Oh, that's so funny.
Because there's a Dan O'Brien novelist who is very well regarded, good writer. And for a while, I was working with his agent, and she got a kick out of the fact that he has alopecia and is completely bald and hairless, and is quite short. And I'm of average height, but very hairy. And she loved that. She just loved that there were these two Dan O'Briens.
The site by Dan O'Brien, is he dead?
Which one?
The guy that wrote Alien?
Oh no, that's Dan O'Bannon.
Oh, Dan O'Bannon.
And I'm not sure. He might be still around, but I'm not sure. That's close though. I've always been envious. Like Dan O'Bannon, that's like a cool Irish name.
Yeah.
Like Dan O'Brien, you might as well be like Fred Brown.
Yeah.
Steve Jones.
John O'Brien. There's one I have to deal with.
It's like my parents were because I'm one of 6 kids. I think my dad was bullied, so he wanted us to have the most innocuous names possible, and he succeeded. So I'm envious of both of you guys. I mean, you're doing better than Dan O'Brien.
I interviewed Chad Post. There's a musician named Chad Post. I just texted him. I was like, will you come on this podcast with me and talk about your music? Because we have the same name. And he's like, sure. So we did a whole 3% podcast, music episode that's very weird, that involves this long conversation, which I talked to Chad. Chad Post talks to Chad Post.
Oh, I'll send you this little prose poem, Chad, because
the
reason it started was because when I started as a playwright, there was another Dan O'Brien playwright.
Oh.
And I guess lucky for me, he kind of around the same time stopped writing plays. But one of my first rejections from a theater was a rejection from my play, but it referenced like all of these other plays that I hadn't written. And so I felt like it was very confusing because on one hand, I thought, well, maybe this guy's an okay playwright and I can sort of ride his coattails,
Yeah.
But I don't think he was. And then a friend of mine, years later, I found out a friend of mine had gone on a blind date with him.
Oh my God.
20 years ago, and said he was the most pompous ass she'd ever met. And then he had told her at the time that he wasn't going to write plays anymore because he had said everything he needed to say.
Oh God.
The phrase that stuck with me.
Wow.
So I feel lucky because I'm
a pop star doppelganger, and Brian, you have a famous comic book writer as your doppelganger, and you have now taken over as the playwright Dan O'Brien. There's no one else.
Although in the last few years, I've heard that, and I think I've read some of his poems. There's a Daniel O'Brien poet. Oh. And so I've had a few people ask me, "Hey, are you Daniel?" I'm like, "No, that's Daniel. That's Daniel O'Brien. I'm Dan O'Brien." And actually, when I went because I went like as an undergrad, like a scholarship kid to Breadloaf in the mid '90s.
Yeah. And
that was my first experience where somebody said, "Are you the Dan O'Brien?" And I was like 20. Yeah. So for a second, I was like, "Why, yes, I am." And clearly, we cleared it up that I think she was thinking of the Dan O'Brien of alopecia.
Oh, yeah.
Already well established at the time.
Very different.
But yeah, I've always been envious of writers with interesting names.
Absolutely. Okay. Anything else anyone want to add to this? I'll plug your wife's show. Everyone should watch Avenue 5 if they haven't.
Oh yeah, and it will come back. The latest, it's on HBO. The latest is they're going to start filming this summer for season 2. But season 1's out there.
I think one of the last times I was at someone's house was your house, Brian, for Isaac's birthday, which is around Valentine's Day, talking to your sister about how awesome Avenue 5 and McMillions were.
Ah, okay.
Tie this all together, and then the world ended.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so strange because that Avenue 5 is kind of about the world ending in a certain way.
Yeah.
And it was, but it did have a mixed reception. We weren't sure it would come back.
I never looked at like what anyone else ever said. I just loved it. I just like unabashedly was like, you guys need to watch this. Poor octopus, 8 arms, no hands. Fuck you, God. It's still one of the greatest lines that's ever been spoken on TV.
I think part of it was, it's the creator of Veep.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people just were expecting something more like Veep. Yeah. And it is just like a kind of a straight ahead. There's really not much satire, or it's very broad satire.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a sci-fi dark comedy,
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
check it out. I have nothing to do with it. I visited the set once.
Good enough.
Yeah, our daughter sat in Armando Iannucci's director's chair for a second.
Nice.
and then we got out of there. That was about the extent of my involvement. But it was fun.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for doing this. It's super fun.
No, thank you. I had a great time. I hope that was, interesting to people listening, but I had a great time talking about it and reading the book. I'm going to keep reading it.
Absolutely. Good.
And keep listening.